Hi, welcome to our virtual curators tour of Working with the Muse from Studio Art Quilt Associates. We were pleased to offer this virtual tour live via Zoom this past weekend on Saturday, March 28th, and had just a little trouble with our technical difficulties in recording the first portion of the live tour. So I'm here to supplement that with another version of that, which we will edit together with the last half of our live portion. So please excuse the cut from just me to me and my colleague and myself. So I was joined by Linda Severson-Guild, who worked with us on this exhibition to talk about her expertise in quilting and offer her perspectives on some of the work shown, as well as her own piece. And we had some questions asked at the end, so we hope that you'll stick around for the rest of this recording. And I'm going to provide some information on what we missed in the recording just in the beginning portion, which wasn't too long. So we'll get started. First, I do want to thank everyone from Studio Art Quilt Associates who participated in this exhibition, as well as Linda for organizing this and participating in our live tour. We would love to have everyone in person, but are happy to provide the second best, which is this virtual tour so that people can enjoy the exhibition from home. You will see a link to this Dropbox folder that I'll be sharing with you virtually today. So you can also look at the images on your own time and at your own leisure. And we won't have time to talk about every single piece, but you can always email visualarts@strathmore.org for any information. All of the works are for sale. So if you would like to support one of the artists on display by purchasing one of their works for your own home, we certainly welcome that. And you can email us again at visualarts@strathmore.org. So before we get a look at the quilts in the exhibition, you may be familiar with quilts in your own home. You may use them as bedspreads. You may have been gifted a quilt made by a family member. And those are a little bit different from the quilts that we're going to look at today. The quilts that you may be familiar with typically follow a pattern. Whether that's something that's been passed down, a historical pattern, or sometimes artists will design their own patterns, but if they are mimicking the styles, those historical patterns with quilts, they probably would not fall under the category that these do. So the difference between those quilts and the quilts that we'll see is that these are art quilts. Studio Art Quilt Associates has a mission to promote the appreciation, sorry, we're looking for that word, promote the appreciation of art quilts, contemporary art quilts. And artists creating those quilts are not really following a pattern. They're expressing themselves however they wish to in their quilt making. You'll see plenty of examples of some really creative usages of different materials and methods, and incorporating the different elements of quilting in ways that are really at its core artistic and expressing a vision of the artist. The title, Working with the Muse, was the prompt for the artists who submitted their quilt work. We asked quilt makers, and the association asked the quilt makers who are members in that organization to submit works that speak to what their muse is, what is their inspiration. So we're looking at inspiration itself as the inspiration. So we'll get to see a little bit of what each artist selected as they responded to that prompt. And thinking about those quilt elements and how they're incorporated and approaching their inspiration, it would be helpful to know a couple different terms. One would be the quilt sandwich. A quilt at its very basic level is called a quilt sandwich. That is the technical term, and it has three elements. The first will be the quilt top. I have a piece of fabric here as an example, but this would be the design that you look at on the quilt as it's hung on the wall. Since these are art quilts, they are going to be hung on the wall. The inside is the batting, and that is cotton, or in some cases, wool. Those are the most common batting. And they're thick and not necessarily fluffy, but give structure to the inside and gives relief to the stitching of the quilt, which we'll get to in a second. Then there is the backing of the quilt, which is typically just a plain piece of fabric. Sometimes it's leftover fabric from another project. And here we just have an example of the backing, which has some spray adhesive to keep that structure together, ready to go through and be stitched. Stitching is the other term that we want to make sure we cover. Stitching is any type of threading going in and out of the fabric. You're going to see examples of very creative stitching, stitching that follows patterns or is free form, stitching that complements the subject matter of the work. And what's really wonderful about art quilts is that you can absolutely appreciate the image from far away, but they really beg you to get closer and take a look at the details and how the stitching has been incorporated as a part of the artistic practice. Most of these are machine stitched. There are a couple examples of hand stitching, a little bit few and far between, but those will be highlighted as we go on in this tour. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. And let's see. Fabulous. So now you'll be able to look at the images that we have of our exhibition. We're starting off with Bodhi Leaf by Alice Megorian and Patience, Perseverance, and Play by Barbara Dahlberg. And nature was an inspiration for so many of the artists on display. And we are starting here with Alice Megorian's work, Bodhi Leaf. So as we zoom into her work, we can see that she's taken inspiration from the life cycle of a tree. We have really alive, beautiful green leaves, and she's showcasing them as they decay down onto the forest floor. You can see seeds sprouting up in this area here, and she's used a dye technique on the left to mimic the rings of a tree when you can see that cut from the inside. She's used an applique here for these decaying leaves to represent the decaying leaves. And applique is going to be any time that you take another piece of fabric and sew it on top of the quilt. So we have some stitching that's accenting her dye technique in the left-hand corner of the image. And then we have the applique on the right. Now, looking at Barbara Dahlberg's work, Patience, Perseverance, and Play, she was very much inspired by a birdhouse that she put up in her backyard that was taken over by a mama squirrel. So she was inspired by the mother's perseverance, but also the playfulness of the squirrels, as you can see in the corner here. This is also a wonderful example of just how stitching can be used to accent and define any representational images in the quilts. Stitching is very much like mark making, and you can use that to define an image of squirrels or in an abstract manner, as we'll see as we move on through the works. Offspring by Julia Gaff is a wonderful example of the elements of piecing in quilt making. She has many different small pieces of fabric used here, and you can imagine that a quilt maker would produce a lot of fabric waste as you're cutting out shapes and different patches and appliques for your quilt making. You may have a lot of scraps, and this is just a really wonderful use of smaller pieces of fabric. Quite a bit of work to sew all of this together, but she's beautifully arranged it by color to create the flowers, and it's a wonderful practice to be able to use perhaps scraps of fabric that wouldn't have been used otherwise. In Offspring, we also see an example of binding. Whenever you see a border on a quilt and another piece of fabric, the term for that would be binding. So here there is a fabric that is utilized within the image of the quilt, here down in the stems and leaves of the flowers, and that's used to hold the work together. It's really the purpose of that is then to cover up the edges of your quilt top and mask what's inside, and then from the back, and give it a really clean finish. On the left, we have Kissed by Spring by Kay Campbell and Prayer Warriors on the right. And Prayer Warriors by Catherine Wilson is one of my favorites in the exhibition for how it relates to story quilts. You may be familiar with artist Faith Ringgold. She has some works at the National Museum for Women in the Arts, so we encourage you to look at their website on their online collection. She is an artist working in story quilts. And story quilts are exactly what they sound like. If you're not familiar, they tell a story. You may also be familiar with the AIDS quilt, which would probably be more of a memorial quilt. But there are some similarities there in that they're telling the story of the people who were affected. In this case, Catherine Wilson did share with Linda that she was struggling with the theme and thinking about what inspiration she could focus on for her quilt making. And she mentioned being quite inspired by the women at her church who pray. And so she's featured a church at the top of the hill. I particularly like her choice in fabric for representing the stained glass windows. Lots of different pieces of fabric to give a very impressionist-like image of the sky and the road and the green grass on the hilltop. And she's chosen really lovely patterns for the dress of the woman going to church, whether it be in their accessories or in their clothing. So I really appreciate the story that she's telling here and how she is looking to members of her community as inspiration. So we won't be able to talk about all of the works on display, but Kissed by Spring by Kay Campbell has some wonderful stitching that echoes the different structures of stems and grasses. And so we really see the evidence of inspiration by spring in this case. A Distant Light by Floris Flam is heavily inspired by Floris's inspiration that she gets from cityscapes. So we see many building-like structures in this and the shapes that she's created, thinking about what different skylines, city skylines look like, and taking inspiration from the shapes created from that. Now, we have been looking at works in our dining room at Strathmore, and we were really happy to have these pieces for the wall that you first see when you enter. So when you first enter our building and you turn left, which is how most people begin the exhibition, they immediately see on the right Donna Radner's piece, and on the left Andrea Finch's. And Andrea Finch's Magnolia Grandifloria 4 is a great case for looking at a quilt that may challenge how you think about quilt making, what you think quilts are supposed to look like. So it's really interesting to have that confrontation when you first enter the room. And she is inspired by the magnolia flower, but is very much taking some liberties here, some artistic liberties, to add lots of different patterns and colors to her flower. She has taken lots of different patterned fabrics and quilted together these spindly pieces for the inside of the flower. And she's incorporated some wire not only in those spindly pieces, but in the petals to give it structure and to make sure that it does stay three-dimensional in the sculptural form that she intends it to. She's also looked at, and this is just a close-up of the work. she's also looked at in the bottom of the piece, the magnolia before it blossoms. So really taking inspiration from the full life cycle. And again, taking some beautiful artistic liberties in her color scheme and bringing out some really vibrant colors in order to evoke the feelings of inspiration she gets from this flower. The Light Within by Donna Radner is a wonderful example of how artists use dyeing techniques in their work. Donna Radner has hand-dyed, I believe, all of the fabric in this piece and folded or pleated this and created stitching. And by folding and pleating, she's really creating a brand new pattern from from fiber that she has dyed and created her own palette for. Much like painters mix their own pigments and their own paints. Quilters also like to achieve colors that they wouldn't be able to find in commercial printed fabrics or any sort of patterning or designs that they might not be able to find otherwise. So hand dyeing is something that we see quite a bit in this exhibition, and Donna Radner is a fabulous case for that. So we won't get to talk about all of the pieces as I mentioned, but here we have a three-dimensional quilted sculpture by Susan Callahan called My Muse Gives Me Wings, which is an ode to sugar being her muse. And we have two other examples of one on the left of some great hand dyeing techniques, and on the right another one of Andrea Finch's, which uses those wire amateurs to give structure to the work. So Dalashir Davis here in Inner Muse is working with the mixture of hand dye and commercial fabrics, some stitching in circle patterns, some painting of a face as you see here on the left. And then again, in Andrea Finch's work, as I mentioned, using some wire to create structure and the quilted applique she's adding to her pieces. Another one of Donna Radner's pieces, Earth, Water, and Stone number 3, showcases yet again some beautiful hand dye techniques. You can really see the earth tones that she's using complement her vision. If you think about the concept of earth, water, and stone, those three elements, what hues do they bring up? And she's really evoked the qualities of water in her application of the dye technique as well. So here we have a vision or an image of our main hall, which is the second room that you enter in the exhibition. And we're starting off with The Red Spot by Elizabeth Davison. So not only do quilt artists work with dyeing their own fabrics, but they can also paint them. So in this case, Elizabeth Davison is acting as both quilter and painter. She's painted her surface and it's evoking Chinese brush painting or sumi ink. And she has a wonderful contrast of white, black, and red. But I want to call attention to the stitching that she has here, which I believe is most likely going to be hand stitching. This is called a running stitch, if you can imagine the thread running across the fabric here. But it's also echo stitching. And echo stitching is a technique where you stitch just outside another shape to echo it, to carry that shape in another color, in another form through the stitching. So outlining the areas where she's painted, she's accented with this beautiful red thread as she has used her running stitch to echo their shapes. And it really particular pops on the bottom when she's using it on the black border on the bottom section. So with this image, we're going to actually be jumping into our recorded segment. But just to give an introduction, we have Insight by Misty Cole on the left and Marking Change on McBride's Hill by Linda Strobridge. And we're going to hear from Linda Severson Guild in talking about a faced edge. And a faced edge is different from binding. If you remember, binding would be the border of a quilt. A faced edge is when the design meets the edge of the quilt completely. So I'm going to go ahead and edit in Linda and the rest of our recorded session from this past Friday, and stay tuned throughout for more of our exhibition.
And then it's all hand stitched on the back side.
Great, thank you. It's definitely effective in this case with Linda's, where you have the design that meets the edge. And I really appreciate that she has used different pieces of fabric and organized that by color to create areas of color that have dimension to that. We have some examples of where or some details of the sections of blue, as well as the sections of yellow here, and how she's not sticking strictly to yellow. She's incorporating white, some red, some gray, and kind of very organically mixing these planes or separating the planes, but still having that color carry throughout. And this piece is the piece that Linda was talking about earlier, which is Insight by Misty M. Cole. You may recall she mentioned that during our docent training, I asked our docents what they saw in this. And so many people go to the abstraction first, which I think is great. I think it's sometimes hard for people to go to the abstract place first. But in this case, Misty is taking inspiration from the lighthouse lamps or bulbs. And you can see how she's taking what is the background on the sides of the work and really masterfully changing how or adjusting how it would be reflected in the light itself. So we have the bulb in the middle, and then we have what would it be in real life, this infinite bouncing around of light and reflection, and how she's incorporated that in her quilt is really remarkable, and how she's been able to imagine that these trees in the background and the mountains would then become these swirls of green on the inside. And here's just a detail of that as well. So we have quite a few other pieces. This one is City Corner at Night. So you can imagine this is the corner in the street lamp here. So we'll run through a few of these so we can get to our next room. Although before we do that, I do want to talk about this piece here, Starlight, Star Bright, by Helen Blumen. And she was inspired by her many travels and collected many of these fabrics on her travels and then quilted this star design. And Linda, maybe you can speak to this, but I really loved how you mentioned how the group worked together to offer her some advice on how to elevate the work. Can you speak about that process and how the artists collaborate?
Yes, because Helen brought this to one of our meetings, and she said it's very flat because it was just the star on the blue, which had all been quilted, but she had quilted the blue with the same color as the fabric. And so we were sitting there and we said, you know, you need to add a gold to reinforce the sparkle that you get in the fabric and make it, as Gabby said, the echo stitch, repeat the shape out and make it look as if it's shining. And so that's what she did. And she, again, did the running stitch, or as Helen refers to it, the cantha stitch, which suggests that she's referring back to stitching that's done in India. And she felt so much better about the quilt after just adding these few lines.
Great, thanks so much, Linda. I really love that. This exemplifies how the group works together. I think so often, you know, people look at a piece of artwork on a wall, and while it is the artist's vision and their creation, it's hard to gather from that the background story of who else might have had influence over the work or inspiration. And I think that there's so much strength in organizations like SAQA, where artists can work together, offer advice, give ideas, and it's a really lucky thing to have as an artist. So I'm glad that we have an example of how that was very fruitful in this exhibition. The next one is Dawn Begins by Julia Gaff. And this one was a hit with the kids, I gotta say. They had a lot of fun with the elephant, and that really made my day. So we'll have a recording of that actually up later if you would like to sort of see that. But it was great to have some kids inspired by the elephant. And in this case, we've got some more examples of painting on fabric. So this vegetation created with paints, and then stitching on top of that as well. There are some more muted colors in the background with dye. And then we also have, without the paint, just some stitching to indicate some vegetation, such as the tree here.
And Gabby, this is an example of what we call a whole cloth quilt. It's one piece of cloth where Julia has altered the surface by painting and what have you, so that you don't perceive it when you first look at it, but it's all art. There's just, and drawing, there's no piecing.
Yes, thank you for that. You can see the binding there. So that is creating a border, because we've definitely got some stitching in here. But absolutely, none of this is another piece of fabric. And we'll have some examples of that later. But when you have one piece of fabric on top of another, you would call it applique. Sometimes you will cut a hole into the fabric and put a piece of fabric underneath, and that's called reverse applique. But this is a great example of how quilting doesn't have to be taking a bunch of scraps of fabric or pieces of fabric and putting that together. She's designed the surface. She definitely has the quilt sandwich, so that's that's the main element of the quilts there. But she's simply just using, and simply and not so simply, using different dye techniques and painting techniques, stitching, different colors of stitching to create this image. I particularly love how she's used her stitching to indicate the wrinkles and folds of the skin on the elephant. I can look at the elephant and see how this would be an inspiration for a quilter, because there's so much texture to an elephant, and different even tones of gray. She's included some purple in that skin tone too. So I can see how this would really offer that an elephant would offer a quilt maker a lot of content to work with and use different techniques for. This is another example of Linda Strobridge's work. This one is called Splintered. We have some more examples of how she's mixed different fabrics and different colored stitching as well. But I would really like to get to our next room, which is our small gallery. And in our small gallery, we have a lovely sort of color combination. In curating the show, we really looked at textures, different examples of technique, making sure they're all represented in the same space. And in this room, we had this wonderful mix of these oranges, complementary blues, peaches, and grays and blacks. So you're going to see that in the next few coming up. So the first one we'll look at is Pathways by Lan of Dragon. So I'm actually going to scoot through the details so that I can show you the piece in full. So it's a representational image, but she's definitely using some abstract techniques in how she's portraying the hillside in the background, using different patterns there. But what I really appreciate about her work is, while we saw in the red spot an example of a quilt maker that is also a painter, or in the case of Julia with the elephant, somebody who's also an illustrator, and drawing on her quilt. Lana is incorporating some photography. So there's a photograph of these pebbles that has been printed on fabric. She's used that to indicate the shoreline. And I think it's really effective to see how she's used this mesh material to act as this very clear wave coming ashore. So having the pebbles layered underneath. We have another example of the photo on fabric here in the water, and she has used the stitching to bring out the details of the ripples in the water. I also really appreciate how you can see how that stitching differs when the water meets the dock. You have her stitching echoing the ripples in the water, but then on the wooden dock, really echoing the wood grain. So it's, as Linda said in the beginning, you know, you can see the quilt from afar and absolutely get the full design and visual impact. But as you get closer is when you get to see how the artist has incorporated the different techniques and details of quilt making to create that full image, and how even even just simple thread going can become something totally else, and can act as mark making in the work. Elegance by Estelle Porter is another example of painting directly on the surface. She's using a material called Shiva paint sticks, which is, Shiva's a brand, and the paint sticks are sort of like not quite a crayon, not in the way that you think of Crayola crayons, but it's a tool that you can paint much in the way that you would use like a marker or a crayon on the surface. I really appreciate her echo stitching outside of the orange leaves. I think that's such a beautiful detail, especially with the contrast of black to orange, and even the small beads that she's incorporated as well. So you'll see a lot of these vases in her work. She's very influenced by her Greek heritage, and so she's taking some inspiration from their pottery. Domini Nash is a local artist who you may have seen at Strathmore before. She's been in the Creative Crafts Council exhibitions, and she's someone also inspired by nature. She takes life-size print, she makes life-sized prints of leaves, like printing on her fabric, and you can see just every single detail of these leaves here with the different veins within the leaves. And we have another example of her work coming up as well. We have At Water's Edge by Karen Amelia Brown, using applique. You can see in her design that there's a representation of water meeting the edge of the shore. And she's using this applique to create these circles that maybe look like bubbles bubbling up on the side of the shore. Grey Dawn by Catherine Kleman has some wonderful examples of different designs and stitching, from spirals to branches on leaves. And we're back to another example of Domini Nash on the left, looking at those leaf designs. Linda, do you have anything to add about her technique of using the leaves in printing these?
Domini has been doing this for so many years that she is like our go-to when we have a question about how to do this type of thing, because these are silk screen printed. So she said that she has a passion for leaves, and she picks them up from the neighbor's yard and just plays with them, manipulates them, does so many different things. And you see them time and time again. You can see where she's repeated the same image from the silk screen on this multiple times. So it's all in the play, and then how the stitching actually tells you which leaves you're supposed to be looking at. It's an absolute delight.
Yeah, she's absolutely someone who you can recognize her work because of her technique and her subject matter. She's mastered this over so many years. So I hope that you recognize her if you've seen her before. So we also come to two here. So on the right is actually Linda's, and on the left is Simple Joys by Kay Campbell, and we'll start with Kay's. I really was stricken by this fun mixture of materials and using ceramic tiles that she's created as another, not applique in the technical sense of fiber applique in her work, but using these ceramic tiles to tie in and add another detail to her work. And you can see how she's taken inspiration from nature, perhaps the simple joys, and highlighted them with an applique underneath. You have this orange piece of fabric that's been sewed on as almost a border for those ceramic tiles. But on to Linda's. So Linda, I'm going to let her talk mostly about this, but I wanted to say how incredible this work is in person. I hope that everyone gets a chance to see it. It is a marvel in how she has created different layers and holes. So everything that you see in the image here that appears to be on top of one another is in real life. So you could theoretically run your hand through this bar underneath, and that is loose and free from the surface of the quilt. So there are definitely some details here that we can look at, but Linda, please, if you could just talk a little bit about your process. It's much more interesting to hear from you, I think.
Oh, thank you. This was a new technique that I was trying, and I was trying to figure out how to separate layers so that they read as separate layers and still were attached all at the top. And I tried to stitch down the piece that you see that has the blue stitching in it with the hole in it. And I tried to stitch that down at the bottom, and it kept fighting me because it did not want to be stitched down. And this is one of those things where when you start playing with the fabric, sometimes it just says, no, I'm not going to do that. I will not respond. I will not reply. And it's amazing how you can be forced into something that you didn't anticipate because the fabric just says, not doing that today. And so when I was trying to put this together, I had to decide where the various layers, because there's 3 layers on top of the background, and where the background began and ended and where the other layers picked up from it. And as you can tell, all the blue here is on the background piece, the blue sky. And then the beam that runs across is sewn in at the blue sky on the right, above the top, and then down around where it connects into the ceiling itself. And trying to figure out how to make this work and to get it to stand out away from the background piece was a challenge. And it's all in how you do this. And somebody looked at it and they said, well, how did you do this? And I said, I actually stood on my head a lot, trying to figure out if I layer something, how would the next layer respond? Because like I said, the beam that I was just talking about is actually standing in front of the lighter gray wall. And if I'm trying to tell a story about where the light's coming from, every piece has to change color to a degree, because you want to say the light is falling here, therefore it's going to look like this. And so it's all in trying to tell a story without saying a word.
Great, yeah, and I think that you absolutely have achieved that here. Sorry, just a second, I've got a message in the chat, I think. Nope, okay, we're good. It's very different, and I'm so glad that we have this in the show, because it speaks very well to the idea of the art quilt as something that you're really pushing boundaries and communicating a vision. And creating solutions with the basis of quilt making, but creating alternative methods and solutions to presenting your vision here.
One thing I'd like to add, if I could,
Yes.
my muse is the line. So everything was linear with the exception of the curvy lines on the window outside. Even looking through into the green of the grass or the leaves beyond, it's all still straight lines, but I had to connect it the same way I would if I were doing an architectural drawing.
I love that. It's interesting to me that I've worked with quite a few artists who have a background in architecture, and I think that is absolutely a similar phenomenon with them, that their inspiration is the line and the form, and the way that you've used the line and you just these different colors of stitching is really effective. So for the next piece, we have Waterworks by Linda Kolsch. We have two of her works that I'll show you, but she's very inspired by water. So she lives near the bay, and she talks about creeks and streams and rivers as being her inspiration. This is a case of surface design with painting, as we've talked about before in some other examples. I want to get to this one, Water Writing by Linda Kolsch, because I really appreciate her explanation of her inspiration. She speaks about the effect of erosion and water carving into different rocks, as if the water is writing on the rocks and making their mark in the same way that she would make her mark on the quilt or make her mark writing on paper. So she's actually taken some of her photographs, altered them, and printed those onto fabric, as you see with the text here, but done various dye techniques, which really complement or mimic the color tones of the pebbles and rocks that you might see in a river. Linda, I know that you are very familiar with Linda's background and where she lived before the United States. Would you be able to speak to that?
Yes, I have heard Linda speak a number of times, and it always amazes me because her husband was in the military. So sorry about that, it's 2 o'clock. Anyway, she lived in South Korea and learned how to paint with brooms. And then she lived in Belgium, where she said she did all of her dyeing in a musty basement that never quite dried. So she was able to affect how the dye would actually age as it dried. And she's brought these techniques back to the United States now that her husband is retired, and they live on a farm per se. She has chickens next door, and she uses the chicken feathers to use sometimes as brushes. So she's always using the influences around her to affect and create the images that she has. And even like the writing, it may very well be something that she created when she was over in Europe, and she just brought with her, and she's continuing to use those images as she continues to create art. But she said the interesting thing is, now that she is where she is and she's living on a septic system, she no longer dyes because it affects the water table. So she's become very environmentally conscious in that respect too.
So in this case, she's not necessarily dyeing, but painting? Oh, Linda's nodding yes, great. All right, so we're at 2 o'clock, and this is promised to be an hour-long tour, so we're a little behind. So I'm gonna scoot through the rest of them. If you need to log off, no worries, please feel free. But we'll continue with the last room in the show, and then a couple others that are on our landing. So the next one is I think my personal favorite, if I'm allowed to pick a favorite, because I had the pleasure of also installing the work, which was so much fun. So Sam Milford created this installation that you see in the center here, which is using quilt techniques to create the fish, but many other materials for this installation. So I had the pleasure of getting to hang these from this metal creation at the top made from copper tubing and wire fencing. So I have a connection to this piece and just how fun it was. It was very playful and hanging this work. She's created these quilted fish out, and she's got what I imagine to be 3 different types of fish, 3 different species of fish, red, yellow, and blue, from recycled kimono fabrics. And her stitching is, indicating the different scales of the fish. So the different patternings on their sides, and they're really quite friendly in how she's crafted their faces. So they're all hanging from monofilament, and with the fish also she's included washers, which has this effect in the light that from afar, because the monofilament is clear, the fish seem to be swimming and the washers bounce the light in the way that the water would. So it was a really fun piece to hang that is not traditional in the least bit, but a really wonderful example of her stitching techniques. So we have quite a few others. We have Catherine Kleman on the right in some painting techniques, Flores Flam in the middle with some inspiration from cityscapes. And on the left, Metamorphosis by Barbara Matthews, which really tells a bit of a story there, perhaps a personal story. And real quick, I'll just show you the stitching of the flame here, which is really interesting to see how she created that flame image with both the application of these triangle and polygon shapes, but also a more fire-like stitching shape and stitching. We have a few others, Make Us One by Shoshana Spiegel and Journey of Design Principles on the right by Barbara Eisenstein. Make Us One, I love the title as it reflects what happens with a quilt, that you take many different pieces of fabric and make them one together. So I thought that was a really lovely title and allusion to quilt making, perhaps quilt making as a muse itself. So I will also link this Dropbox folder in the chat too, so everyone can take a look at all the works. We have some examples of text, but I want to make sure I get to this piece here, Disintegrating Leaves, Constructions 10 by Melinda Lowy. So she's taken inspiration from Disintegrating Leaves, something that perhaps feels ugly to others, but she's found such beauty in the way that different holes appear in the woods, in the leaves, and how she's incorporated that concept into her work by leaving holes in the quilt itself, but also in stitching these leaves together that really mimic what those disintegrating leaves look like in real life. I think the shadows that happen on this piece behind the leaf are really fabulous and amazing. She's taken that stitching into the surface of the fabric as well. Done that in little windows that she's created, little windows for these leaves to appear. Now, Linda, can you talk about the technique here of joining together the different pieces of fabric?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Basically, what Melinda has done here is create all these different shapes, and then she actually goes in and stitches them together behind, so that what you see is on the front is also on the back, but you'd see it a little rougher because the different shapes look like they're just butted up to each other. And then, like I said, she sews them together behind.
Great. So yeah, it's a little different than what you might see elsewhere in that each piece has its own border, if you will, through that stitching. So it's just another technique to use in quilt making. I also really like here that you can see her stitching mimics the burls and wood. So really taking that inspiration into the stitching itself.
One of the things about Melinda's piece before we depart completely, I like the fact that she has started using clear bars when she hangs pieces, so that even if she cuts holes, the bar does not draw away from the attention that the piece might demand.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's her transparency.
Yeah, she found those bars and it offered her something different. Typically, when you have a quilt, you might have a dowel rod at the top to hang from. But if you had a piece of wood behind this, you wouldn't get the same effect. And so here she's able to maintain the effect of those holes without having to stick to having one solid piece of fabric at the top. She's able to create whatever shape that she wants and have it be unaffected by the display method. Thank you for bringing that up. So we have some examples of this is called Renaissance Lace Deconstructed and Recreated by Diane Miller-Wallman, who's done her own lace work in the center. So taking apart some other lace, making her own and quilting that all together. Purple Canyon by Barbara Eisenstein is really just full of texture. So we'll get to see that here as she also even leaves some of those threads raw, those edges totally raw. The texture that she achieves through that gives the piece the type of texture you might imagine in a canyon, perhaps, with the roughness of the sand and the walls of the canyon. It's a wonderful example of using texture in the work, as is Who's Sorry Now? And so the title is spelled not sorry as in I apologize, but sorry as in the garment. And using scraps of sari material, there is a woven pattern here that is just exploding with color. And she's actually added some mirrors here as well, as you see within the circles that she stitched those in. As we get closer, this is one of those examples of, you can look at it from afar, but you really have to come up close and see the different flowers that have been added, or different designs that have been added through her stitching, and each one of the squares or rectangles formed by her weaving. She also has the strips of fabric left loose. Again, something that's just not traditional. You wouldn't, perhaps, in a traditional method, you would consider that unfinished, but here it's effective in, not only giving the piece texture, but I think it really evokes the movement of a sari itself. So looking at the sari as inspiration, as you think of the sari fabric draped across one's shoulders, it gives that same type of movement and effect that you would in wearing the sari. So we have two more. Celebration by Estelle Porter is another one of her works. We saw one already called Elegance. She's using those Shiva paint sticks to design the surface, and she's very interested in Greek pottery here. I wanted to particularly highlight this squid octopus figure, which is just it's stitched in, and I think it's such a fabulous highlight of the piece and focus on the composition. But I also want to just lastly make sure we touch on Homage to Matisse by Cindy Griselda. If you're familiar with Matisse, you will recognize some of the same shapes and composition here, as she is alluding to him in her work. We have just these wonderful pieces together with such an attention towards composition, a faced edge so that the composition meets the edge of the quilt, and there's no border there. And in these last images, I actually have altered the color just a little bit. So it's not quite true to the yellow that you see, but I wanted everyone to just really get a sense of the stitching and how the color changes in the stitching. So it's really just quite dark in person, but as you get closer to it, this stitching is just this another color element, which I think when you look at it far away, affects how you read those colors in those planes. And then lastly, I just really loved that her signature also incorporated some of the changes in that threading. So I am happy to take some questions. As I mentioned, I'm going to share the folder with everyone here, but Linda will be here to answer any questions. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself or even click the raise hand button.
How long will this be at the mansion?
So this was scheduled through the end of April, but we are hoping, we're at this point extending it without a firm date, only because we are unsure of when we're going to be able to be open. So we're following all CDC, county, state government, federal mandates. So we are required to be closed right now. If that changes, we're going to be able to open. And if you, I left my email on the chat. If you want to save that email or shoot me an email and let me know that you'd like a notification, we're disseminating information about when we will be open again on our website, on our social media, and through our email listserv. But if you shoot me an email, I'll make sure to let you know individually if you'd like to know when we're back open. Unfortunately, we just don't have the answer right now. We're hoping, of course, sooner rather than later, but complying with all mandates.
Thank you.
Sure. And I just dropped the link to the Dropbox, which has all the images that we went over today. Anyone else have a question for me or Linda? If you're having trouble unmuting, you can also add something in the chat. Kara says that they really enjoyed this. All right, thank you so much. I'm glad you were struck by Linda's quilt as well. That's fabulous.
I have a question, Linda. On some of the quilting, it almost looked like hand stitching, but I have the feeling that it was a longer straight stitch. Could you comment? I was just wondering which machines they're using and
Across the board, other people are using?
yeah, for some of them, at first I thought it was a hand running stitch, but then when I got a little closer to the computer, it looked like it was actually a machine stitch that was looking like a quilting stitch.
Yeah, most of what you saw was machine stitching, and we all use various types of machines. We're very protective of our sewing machines and our scissors, and we take care of them as much as we do our children. So I don't know. In some cases it is difficult to tell what is what, unless you look at the back. If you're able to look at the back, you can always tell which ones are machine and which ones are hand, because the machine will be perfect on the back as well, whereas the hand stitching will not. That's the best way to tell.
Okay, and is there a machine? I do traditional quilting, and I did look once at upgrading my machine, but is there a machine that has a stitch that looks like a traditional hand quilted straight?
No.
No.
Yeah. all of the quilting machines look like a back stitch as opposed to a straight stitch.
Okay.
There really is nothing because the thread has to continue. And so it's not possible.
Okay, thank you.
Great. If anyone has any other questions. Well, I have listed my email if you want to copy that down. If you have questions come up later, I can also forward any questions to Linda as well. I really hope that you've enjoyed this tour and that you have been able to use this wonderful technology to be able to do so. I have certainly enjoyed it, and I'm glad that we can keep talking about artwork and keep showing artwork despite the current circumstances. Please keep a lookout on our website. We have not yet announced it, but we're going to continue to do these tours and various talks with artists every Friday at 4 p.m. Take a look at our website. We should be announcing that next week, shortly into the week, so perhaps Tuesday. But mark it on your calendars, Fridays, 4 p.m. We're going to be meeting on Zoom. Next week, we're going to be joined by Mandy Moreland, who has a show up in our invitational gallery. And she's going to come on and talk about her artwork. So we hope you can join us then and for our future programs. But I also want to make sure to thank Linda. Linda, thank you so much for participating and participating with your knowledge and sharing that with everyone. It's a wonderful resource to have. Thank you once again.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate this.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. See some people saying thank you in the chat. Thanks again. So I'll close out the meeting, but please make sure to copy down my email address. If you don't see it in the chat, you can just reach me at visualarts@strathmore.org if you have any questions in the future. Thanks again.